So, yeah, join me in James, rather, chapter 4, James 4, verses 13 to 17. And I've titled this study Deo Volente, and you're going to find out, and some of you may be very familiar with that term, but I actually first heard that term from Barbara Crocker. But let me read the scripture to you, and then we'll get into the study. So again, James 4, verses 13 to 17. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. That's a tough passage. The reason that's a tough passage is because we find ourselves in that passage a lot when we're talking about doing things. And we're all doing things. Even if we're not doing something, you're making a choice about whether you're going to do it or not. There's activity or lack thereof that's going along. So many of you may remember Barbara Crocker. If you didn't have a chance to meet Barbara Crocker, Barbara and Jim, two of the coolest cats on the planet. They used to attend our church. They decided that they were going to start attending a church a little closer to home. Totally get it. Totally understand. But we were talking one time. Well, I say talking. We were texting one time. And she said that she was going to do something, and then she ended it DV. Now, I'm almost hesitant to say that because I admitted to something that I'd never heard of before, but evidently some of you had heard of it a lot. I had never heard of Juneteenth. I'd never heard of Juneteenth before, but evidently there were some that had heard about it for years and years, and they just couldn't believe it. And I understand, and I'm like, I don't know, I just didn't come across it. And I'd never come across DV. DV is a Latin term meaning Deo Volente. Deo means God or the Lord. Volente, volition, will, if the Lord wills. So, whenever you're talking about that, and you're talking about making plans, what James is saying here is, anytime you start trying to make a plan about something, put the caveat there, if the Lord wills, or as Jesus said in the Garden of Gethsemane, what? Thy will be done. You know, that's what we have to ask for. This passage of scripture is tough because really, well, it's not tough in the sense of, it's very simple to understand. So, that's what makes it so tough. It's so simple to understand, yet it's so hard to do. So why is it so hard to do? Well, if you remember, if you were engaged in the sermon on Sunday, well, the weekend. If you're engaged on the weekend sermon, it was on Psalm 14, the fool says in his heart there is no God. So there's people that have a philosophical atheism, which means that they don't believe that there's any supreme being at all. But then there's also practical atheism. And it's not that they don't believe that there's no supreme being. It's not that they don't believe that God is active in the affairs of man. It's just we act like he's not. Practical atheism. It's a lifestyle. It's a practice. That's where we say the word practical. So we get into this. That's what this is all about. So what's this guy saying here? Okay, so he gives the example. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. What's happening here is a semi-reversal of James 1:22, where he says, don't just be hearers of the word, be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. Well, what's happening here is that we are doers who do not engage in God's word. We hear what God's word has to say, but we're doing something the polar opposite. It's like it's almost inside out. And so here we are making our plans. And I really struggle with that. I struggle with, on one hand, in my personal life, yeah, there's plans that make sense. We're getting ready to go on a trip in about a week and a half. Makes sense. Yeah, let's do that. Okay. Is it the Lord's will for us to do that? Did I ever ask that? God, is this your will? Now, I think there are times when he opens up doors and that it's very clear where to walk through. And sometimes we just sit and spend so much time praying about it, looking for a specific way that that we think God is supposed to answer. It's like the story of the guy who's on the top of a house and the flood is rising and he's praying to God, God, will you please deliver me from this flood? Well, as he's praying, a boat comes by. And, hey, I got plenty of room if you want me to take you to safety. No, the Lord's going to deliver me. And then a helicopter comes over and the ladder comes down. Hey, you just come on up. And he's like, no. The Lord's going to deliver me. And one other thing happened like that. And he said, no. And the floods rose and he drowned. And so the guy is standing before the Lord and and the guy is just incredulous. But God's asking him, what are you doing here? This is not a completely theologically sound story, but God's like, what are you doing here? Well, I was praying to you to deliver me, and you didn't deliver me. He's like, I sent you a boat, I sent you a helicopter, I sent you this other thing. What did you want me to do? You see the idea? Is that sometimes we so pigeonhole God into how he's going to answer that he may be opening up a door for us, answering a prayer from a long time ago, or a commitment we made a long time ago, and he opens the door for you to walk through, and sometimes we hesitate. But this is a guy who's saying, and remember, he's talking to believers. This book is about talking to believers, not unbelievers who don't believe that God really is a part of their life. He's talking to believers, but who are acting like God's not a part of their life. What's happening here? He's saying, oh, well, of course, this is the place to go. This is the thing to do. This is an absolute no-brainer. We got this. What's to think about? What's to pray about? Of course we're going to do this. Now, if you go back to James chapter 4, or in the same chapter, I should say, verses 7 to 10. And you remember what's being said here. Submit to God. Resist the devil. I won't read the whole thing, but you get it. Submit to God. Resist the devil. He'll flee from you. Draw near to God. He'll draw near to you. Cleanse your hands. Purify your hearts. Be wretched and mourn and weep over your sin. Humble yourselves. These are not one-off activities. This is a lifestyle that he is calling us to live. Everything that we do, everything that we say, everything that we think are based upon these marks that God has given us in his word. And so again, you come to church. Oh yeah, I'm a great Christian. I come to church. Well, do you live like the devil Monday through Saturday? Do you live as if God's not a part of the process, not a part of your plans, not a part of anything? You're not taking him into calculation at all. We've got to be very, very careful that these aren't one-off activities. Christ is our life that we are to make much of, not just an activity on the weekend that we're to just check off of our list. Stay, not you guys. I'm talking to the computer. So here's a couple of things that are happening here. Number one is that we have a limited scope. You do not know what tomorrow will bring. Do you? How many of you bought planners at the beginning of 2020? Did any of you do that? You buy a planner where it's a Franklin Covey planner or something in your iPad or your tablet or something. You buy this, and what do? You make plans. January, yeah, I got some birthdays going on, got some party going on. We had plans throughout the entire year here at church. And you know what happened after the service on March the 8th? Not one of those plans that we wanted took place. We had worship services, but nobody could be in the room. Didn't plan for that. And then all of a sudden, there was no way in January 1st that we were thinking, okay, we got to take everybody's temperature when they come in the room, and everybody's got to wear a mask and be away from each other, which is just feels like a slow death, not being able to be around each other and be able to be a little more tactile. But we have a limited scope. And if there's anything that COVID has taught us, And it's a lesson that we have to make sure transfers over into every other aspect of our lives, is that we have a limited scope. We don't know what tomorrow brings. We also have a limited lifespan. We have a limited lifespan. Now, those who are really young, we all remember that. We thought that, wow, 20 was really old, and 30, really old, 70, oh my gosh, just throw dirt in his face. I mean, it's just incredible. But then as the older we're getting, and all of a sudden, well, 50's not so old. 60's not so bad. And all of a sudden you get into this deal to where you realize, Billy Graham was asked one time, what is the one thing that he wished he had realized earlier in his ministry? And he said, I wish I had realized the brevity of life. And he said that when he was 64 years old. And of course, he was just a whisker shy of 100 when he died. But even then, 64 years old, because he said it felt like yesterday was 20. I'm starting to feel that now, because it feels like from Sunday to Sunday is only about 2 days. It's getting away from me. We're planning vacation. Oh, it's months away, and now it's weeks away, and pretty soon it's going to be days away. It's one of those things. But we also can have an unlimited arrogance. And this is where you have to go back to this and see how important it is that we make sure that God is part of all of our processes, the triune God of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He says, this is what you ought to do. You ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. Okay, but since you don't do that, what is he saying here? Well, he's not pulling any punches. He's saying this, as it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Now think about what he's saying here. Remember the marks. Submit to God, resist the devil, draw near to God, he'll draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, purify your hearts, be wretched and mourn and weep, humble yourselves. That's a lifestyle. When Christ is made much of us, as far as the cross is concerned, we make much of Christ in our lives. But if we make a plan, think about this. If you make a plan, say, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this next year. And you haven't prayed about it. You haven't sought God's will. You haven't sought his wisdom. You haven't sought his counsel. You haven't sought any of that. I mean, you have just been operating this way. It says we're arrogant. That we're evil. The activity is evil. He's rescued us from our sin, but this is part of the sanctification process, is that this may have been just a piece that they hadn't thought about, or they had thought about and disregarded. That's pretty bad. But the idea here is that there is an unlimited arrogance that's here, and then he gives us the punchline of it all, but it's no joke. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it. Think about that in anything. When I first came back to the Lord, I say came back. I came to Christ when I was almost 11. Strayed pretty good. I moved around a lot, and I got to where I was really wanting people to like me. Brand new kid, wanting people to like me, and I began to drift big time. 19, the Lord brought me back, and I just remember every little thing. It was like, is this the right thing to do or not? It kind of drove me nuts after a while. I mean, it was just because it's so much, you just don't want to ever let anything down. But it's like, if there's a piece of paper and I walk on the ground and I walk by it, that verse would pop into my head. You know the right thing to do. Pick up that piece of trash. Okay. And then I would go and pick up the piece of trash and I would throw it away. And after a while, I got to be like, well, that's kind of silly. Does that verse really mean that? And then it kind of does. But we don't do it because we're afraid that God's going to send us, God's going to send us to hell with an electric fan. That's not why we do what we do. We do what we do, not because we're necessarily afraid of the consequences there will be, but we do this because we want to love God with all that we have. We want to rejoice in all that he is all about, and so we don't want to do anything that will not promote good in the world. And so then it comes back around where it's like, okay, what is there that we can do that's good in the world that we may not be doing? That we may be talking ourselves out of it because of whatever. Well, in reality, if God is impressing upon us to do something good, he may be impressing upon you to give that person a phone call, write that person a letter, Share the gospel. Share the gospel with someone. Encourage someone. You know, give someone some money that's on the street corner without making the excuses that we all have of why we don't need to do that. We may be in that position one time. They say most people in our country right now are 1 to 2 paychecks away from the street. We've got to be careful about how we justify a way doing things because of other man-made constructs that we may end up having. So everything we do, I always think of Barbara Crocker, DV, you know, Deo Volente, if the Lord wills, then we will do this or that. So I don't believe, so let's make sure we're getting the other side of the coin. God is not telling us not to make plans. God is a planner. He has planned out everything that the world has. I mean, we have the book of Revelation that shows us that God has a plan for the future, and it's solid, it's right, it's true, it's perfect. So he's not telling us not to plan. He's not telling us just to float. No, he's telling us, I want you to think through about what you're doing, but I want you to realize you're mine and I'm yours. Bring me into that process, because whether you think I'm in that process or not, I'm there, right there, regardless of what you do. Bring me in, just as I brought you in to myself. Now you live to make much of me in everything that you do and everything that you say and everything that you think. All right, so I hope you could hear me. I would like to hear some feedback from you, something that God may have been showing you in this passage, something that God may have showed you while we're looking at this. And while you're doing that, Paul Smith's on the road again tomorrow. He asked for us to pray for his traveling mercies. They're going to be closing on their house very, very soon. I'm trying. If I don't look over there too much, there's a great ball of fire that is right over you guys. Wow. Absolutely. It's yeah, and I think this is isn't it funny how God, everybody else, I mean, it's a terrible situation that we're going through. It's a terrible situation that we're in. And yet, even in those terrible situations, God's driving home truth that's been there the whole time. And I think have any of you ever prayed, God, whatever it takes to make me a servant of yours, do it? Have any of you ever prayed that? Well, he'll do it. And he's not mean. He's not a mean God. But if you're going to ask for patience, he's not just going to give you patience. He's going to put you in situations where your patience is going to develop. If you're going to ask God, make me one who makes much of you, well, then he's going to put you in a situation. He's not going to just, some he may. But I believe that there's also times that he's going to put you in situations to where you're like, okay, I've got to rely on you because I sure don't have much else right now. We have a lot in our country to where there's so many conveniences that it can also put us as Christians at a big disadvantage, because we're all of a sudden in a position to where anything we want, we can go to Amazon and buy. We can go up the street. We have so many resources. God may put us in a position at some point to say, you're all I have.
And I think that's one of the points that strikes this country so hard, is because we have had the resources. We're used to being kind of self-directed.
Yeah.
Okay, we don't have a big budget this year, we'll take a small vacation. Or we'll just go see grandma or whatever, a staycation.
Yep.
We're used to having choice. And with this COVID thing, they're even taking away our choice.
Uh-huh.
No, you can't go to that restaurant because they got them all shut down.
And we do really well when someone tells us we can't do something. We do really well with that. We have trouble obeying authority. Well, hopefully in the midst of this, that the morale hasn't been so low that you haven't picked up on these wonderful truths that God is reinforcing in his word. And that when we snap out of it, I remember seeing this whole movie, and I just remember it was Burt Reynolds. And Burt Reynolds was about a mile off the coast of the city, you know, off the coast, and he was swimming back in. Lord, if you rescue me, I'll do whatever you want. And then as he gets closer, he starts bargaining. Well, maybe not everything, but I'll give you, you know, and he starts bargaining until by the time he gets to shore, he's completely negated every promise that he made. And that could be what happens here, Lord. But if we ever get out of this, well, I'm in. I'm all in. But then when we start kind of getting our feet back underneath us, well, maybe not. Lord, I think I've got this one now. Got to be real careful.